Hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this afternoon's first session. Can you welcome Bidao Gabi?
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for coming by. For those of you, just out of curiosity, how many in the audience have never heard me give a talk before? Oh, this is awesome, fresh meat. So the fact that I pulled some slides from some really old slide decks is something I might actually get away with. And that's sort of germane because for two reasons. One, I have a long history with LinuxConf Australia. It started in, I think, 2002 in Brisbane. The year of the first ever mini-conf at an LCA happened to be a Debian distribution mini-conf, and some of the Debian folks in Australia suggested they thought it'd be really cool if I came down for that. And they told me it would be really cool, and Brisbane was really hot. And despite all that, they managed to leave me enthusiastic enough at the end of the week that I came back every year until I missed the last two. Those were for different reasons. A couple of years ago, I was just going through a job transition and returning to early retirement, and it just kind of messed up the whole plan to be at LCA. And last year, I was in the Southern Hemisphere, but I was a little farther south. My wife and I had one of those sort of more or less once-in-a-lifetime opportunities to go take a cruise that included 4 days meandering around the Antarctic Peninsula. And I have to say, if you ever have a chance to go to Antarctica, and like me, you're really impressed by sort of the sheer awesomeness that nature can present, definitely, that's something you should go do. But, I had the occasional reminder about you guys while we were there. Millions and millions of reminders. There are so many penguins down there. Also just an amazing number of whales. Spending an afternoon standing on the deck of the ship and sort of watching a pod of 4 humpbacks diving in the krill bloom, and they got a little far away and you turn about 15 degrees and there's another pod, and you turn a few more degrees and there's another pod. One of the more amazing experiences I've had. So anyway, that was fun. That was a year ago. Since I got here this week, I've had a lot of questions from people that have known me from prior events about sort of what's up in my life, how are things going. I guess after I sort of returned to early retirement a couple of years ago in the free software world, I did mostly sort of drop off the map a bit. But there's been a lot of interesting stuff going on. As many of you know, Keith Packard and I have a little business together designing and building open hardware and open source avionics. It's actually kind of cool being back in New Zealand and talking about this because the first successful flight of one of my prototypes, this one right here, was in April of 2009, and it was actually in Wellington at LCA in 2010, beginning of 2010, that we made the commitment to take this cool little hobby project and turn it into a little bit of a business. And so that's, it's been about 10 years since we've been playing with this stuff, and I guess that makes it more or less the 9th or 10th anniversary of having a company. And that actually has been going really well. It's the reason that there are days when I wake up and I feel like I'm sort of retired, and then there are days when I wake up, look at my inbox and go, holy crap, I'm a small business owner. But of course, the really nice thing about having that business going well is it's allowed me to continue having the resources to pile into working on, modest little rocket projects. That's one each, me for scale and my friend Terry, who does a lot of stuff with me these days. Pretty big airframe. This is an upscale of a rocket that my son built years ago. This was the first time we dry stacked it outside the new house. And yeah, that's the new house for those of you who sort of have followed that saga. New house is great, everything's good. It's been more than 4 years since we moved into it. That whole fire thing is kind of distant memory at this point. This is what it looked like when it was fully stacked and ready to fly. A little bit of red paint. We flew it on an O-class motor. Those of you who've played rocket stuff with me before will understand that's a hunkin' big motor. It's 152 millimeters in diameter and about 1.5 meters long of propellant. The whole thing weighed about 76 kilos at launch if I did the units to real units conversion properly. And it worked out to be just over 3 kilometers apogee. And I don't know about you, but anytime I can throw an airframe that big up that has a bright red flame tail that long, causing the back of the rocket to glow, it's a good day. And it's interesting because on that particular weekend at that launch out in southeastern Kansas, that was the largest, heaviest project flown. But unfortunately, it's not the only thing I got a rep for that weekend because things don't always go the way you expect. The very next day, this is a research motor I had designed. That photo on the right is the metal case, the aluminum case that the propellant was in. What you're seeing on the left is the front end of the rocket up there, and those things are flaming fuel grains, 7 of them, that were ejected from the motor when it overpressured. And they sort of went out and did this beautiful fireworks display kind of thing. Somebody actually sent me a video clip of it, but it's horribly noisy and it's not very good, and the clouds in the background make it hard to see. This is actually the best photo I found. But I came away from that weekend with sort of kudos for having flown the biggest rocket and having had the most visually spectacular disaster. And you know, it sort of proves that when we're playing with big rockets, things are either exciting or way too exciting. And in either case, it's a heck of a lot of fun. The other thing that I've been spending a lot of time on, and it's not quite to the point of having spawned off a good reason to give a talk at a Linux conference yet, is that my wife and I have gotten very enthusiastic as empty nesters about spending time on racetracks with the local Porsche club. And I don't know, somewhere out of that, it's like, oh, you know, the kids are gone, we have time, we should build a race car. So this is sort of a Lotus 7 derivative, and the reason I picked this particular photo is I'm really proud of the bespoke red oak dash that my wife and I did for it. She gets credit for all the staining and urethane on all that. The car's a little bit farther along than this now, and I expect we'll have it on the road sometime in the next few months, certainly in time for this year's track season. So anyway, this is the kind of stuff I've been up to. And if you happen to find yourself anywhere near Colorado in the US, let me know, and you know, maybe we can go play with rockets or go hang out at a racetrack or something like that. So anyway, that's sort of all the other stuff people have been asking me about this week and what's going on. But so let's back to the topic at hand. What's this all-in thing? As I'm going to explain over the next few minutes, in the sort of length of my personal engagement in what we now call free and open source software, and over a fairly long and I think pretty successful career in the corporate world flogging this stuff, I've made a bunch of observations about what causes things to go well and what causes things to be a problem. And I have, I sort of learned in the process what were the things that seemed to be the levers that would work in getting the companies I was involved in to take a more fully engaged, collaborative role in the free and open source software communities that they wanted to be engaged with. And what I'm going to try and do today is give you a little bit of a sense of, what some of those arguments are that I've used to help convince people to do what I thought were the right things. I don't begin to pretend that there's only one way to do things or that there's only one answer. And in fact, in a lot of cases, I have a specific example in my mind of something that went well. And I, try to sort of generalize from that. And in a couple of places, I'll make it very clear that, there's a lot of different ways to achieve the same result. But, I won't get hung up over the fact that I did it a particular way and it worked. And if you did it the same way, it might work too. So first, let me give you a little bit of context. I made my first personal contribution of source code to this thing we now call free and open source software in 1979. It was a little bit of assembly language for a then obscure and now almost completely forgotten 8-bit microprocessor, the RCA 1802. And it got published in the newsletter of a little club up in Canada that had been put together by some people who were playing around with these at home. And a lot of interesting stuff came from that, and I've talked about this before. It's even been written up in write-ups about me at various times by different reporters. But I think the sort of key thing here is that this was before a lot of things that people take for common were happening. I really enjoyed Rory's keynote the other morning, but when he talked about readme.md as being the thing we've always done, I just had to laugh because there was life before Markdown. And his point was really well taken, and as somebody who spent time on the board of directors at Lulzbot, which was the first company to get the FSF's Respects Your Freedom Award, or badge of approval, I really understand this motivation for and positive consequences of sort of extreme openness, but history goes back a little farther than that. I actually spent a fair amount of time living and working in the Berkeley Unix kind of world. In fact, my first Unix experiences were all on Vaxxon running BSD at Carnegie Mellon. I was fortunate to be at the university at the point in history where if you had a research grant and were working on a research project, you basically go buy a Vaxxon, put Berkeley on it. We lost track of how many Vaxxon there were on campus at that point. They were not generally used that much for academic classes. They had these crazy DEC 20 things that they used for those instead. But I spent a lot of time playing with BSD and started making contributions to that community in that era. And I learned a heck of a lot from that. And one of the things I learned from it is sort of what it's like to be living in a contribution community that's sort of run by an obscure priesthood. It's funny that in later years, I got to know a lot of those guys in person, and they're awesome. But when you're at the other end of a UCP bang path trying to communicate with them, the whole dynamic was a little different than what we think about in free software today. I also spent a lot of time in the 1980s as the sort of lead cook and bottle washer for integrating, documenting, and distributing Phil Karn's TCP/IP stack for amateur radio. I don't know if any of you have ever stumbled over that before, but in fact, I think big chunks of that sort of were used to put some of the amateur radio protocol stuff in the Linux kernel at some point. Whether that was a good idea or not is something the future can decide. And then there was a point sort of after I'd done a lot of that when the existence of Richard Stallman sort of popped up in my consciousness. I stumbled over the GNU Manifesto. I had a friend who had an office down the hall from him at MIT back in the day. And he said, oh, here's this thing. You need to go read this. You'll be intrigued. And I was. And that led me to be fairly early in my discovery of his assertion of the four freedoms that he thought were the basis of how free software could and should work. And when the GPL was a new thing, I read it and I was really impressed by the hack of taking copyright and sort of standing on its head and using it as a way to sort of preserve and protect and extend freedom. And that's something that's continued to sort of influence my thinking for a long time. It probably explains how when I discovered the very early Debian community, that was something I resonated with. When Ian Murdoch wrote his Debian manifesto, which was in some ways sort of modeled after this conceptual model of explaining what his core values were that Richard had used in the GNU manifesto, I was probably more primed to read something that was in that style and resonate with it than I would have been if I hadn't gone through those other experiences. As all of you know, I've had a long history of involvement. I think I'm now one of the 3 or 4 longest serving continuous contributors to the project. I've also been, deeply involved in some crazily tumultuous times in the history of the project. Yeah, that systemd thing. I'm actually kind of pleased. There's a little social unrest within the project right now, and I believe if it hasn't already, it's on the verge of creating a flame war mail thread that's longer than the systemd one. But it would be kind of nice to be out of that sort of pinnacle of the project's history at some point. And it's also sort of interesting that the way I think about the world has been irrevocably shaped by having spent about a decade as the Linux and open source CTO at what was for a while the world's largest IT company. I mean, it's a stupid label, and certainly the company's done some weird things since then and calved itself into 6 or 8 different subsidiaries and None of them are really as friendly to Linux and open source as the big thing was for a while. But, that's all just sort of part of what adds up to be part of the experience. And what is it that I really have taken from this? Well, I've come to be very focused on the importance of what I think of as the collaborative development model that underpins all of the free and open source software work. And as we've seen in the various keynotes this week, is now, and in other places, this sort of model of behavior and interaction and collaboration has expanded way beyond the bounds of just software. With tentacles out into the free culture world and the way governments are starting to handle certain interactions in some parts of the world, there's a lot that's sort of happened as a result of observing the success of free and open source software. The really important attribute of this is this notion that these things are being developed by a community in a collaborative process where no single company is in charge, and where there's a diverse range of contributors that are coming from different social, economic, geographic, religious, whatever kind of backgrounds, and who have massively different motivations. And what we end up getting out of this is this software commons that we all get to benefit from, and we sort of share in the maintenance of. And it's the economics of that sort of process of developing and maintaining software in a commons that ends up being so incredibly powerful. And the thing that made that really possible is that in the early days of the sort of free and open source software world, driven largely by philosophical motivations, we came up with a set of licenses that reduced the traditional barriers between producers and consumers of software. In effect, we made it possible for any user to become a developer or to pay somebody else to be a developer on their behalf. And it's interesting because I've actually been in the IT world long enough to remember when, in the very early days, that's how it worked. You bought a computer and you got the software. I remember, back in the early days of Digital Equipment Corporation User Society, it was sort of weird to be part of an organization that had so many of their computers that when they held their user society meetings, we'd show up with our list of bugs and the tape full of patches that fixed them all. And that's just kind of the way things worked. And the fact that that software was all, in essence, proprietary, didn't really affect the users because the total number of systems was small. Everybody had the machine, had access to the software, and it was an interesting space. We then went through what I think of is this sort of aberration, which was sort of the emergence of shrink-wrapped application software for standard platforms that behaved and existed in an entirely different space. And I think today we see that there's sort of a persistent tension between the highly curated world of software, as evidenced by, for example, the ecosystems that Apple's built around iOS, where the rules to get in are difficult. And if you're an independent hardware developer like Altus Metrum, don't even pretend that you're ever going to be welcome in that ecosystem. But at the other end of the spectrum, the end user experience is pretty fine. And in the sort of other end of that tension is this thing that says, hey, if we keep everything very free and very open, then we lower the barriers to entry, we have a broader ability for people to participate, and we can take advantage of opportunities that you can't in that sort of a highly curated environment. So one of the things I have had to spend a lot of time over the years in sort of dealing with the corporate executive community, learning how to talk about and how to explain, is this notion of what it means to be successful when you're operating in a more open and collaborative model. I mean, if you think about sort of what the traditional big corporation model of innovation is, the idea is that we're going to make an investment in inventing something new. And then we're going to lock that up through patents or whatever other means so that we can then reap the benefits of commercializing that innovation. And the consequence of that, the positive side of that for the company is that if you're the first person there with some new capability and nobody else can do it for a while, then that provides an opportunity to generate a pretty substantial return on the investment if what you did was good. And if you've created really cool stuff, customers might be willing to reward you. But I personally can't ever really remember a customer ever saying to me, one of my objectives is for you to lock me into you. It's not actually something that customers value. Companies value this, and in some ways it's like, okay, if that's the only way you can think of to operate and make a profit, maybe it's something that companies are valuing because they're lazy. Don't know. In contrast, the collaborative model allows us to recognize the benefit of collaborating on all that non-differentiating software and reducing the cost of participating in that software ecosystem by sharing the work with everyone else who's part of the community, so that we can take the finite resources that are available to us and focus the maximum amount of those on doing things that are truly usefully differentiating for us in the eyes of our customers or users. And at the end of the day, I think in a perfect world, when I was talking to corporate executives, if they could have figured out how to drive virtually all of the software that they had into a completely open model and retained a really thin veneer of customization, differentiation, whatever, that would have been almost the optimal economic model, because it would have reduced the cost of development and maintenance of the majority of the code and allowed them to go really, really nuts on the little bit that they thought would allow them to differentiate themselves in the eyes of the customer. Sometimes it seemed to work, sometimes maybe less so well. But the thing that ended up being sort of important in all of this was that in order to make that mental transition and be willing to think about that change in economics, you had to sort of figure out how to stop thinking so much about control points, having control of your relationship with the customer or having control over who else could participate in the market, and instead think about points of affinity. What is it that would make your customer or user really want to use your product and service? And when you start to focus on this and you start to think about what is the value equation and what is the amount of money that's availably put on the table for the end user to get the experience they want, it turns out that you can have every bit as good, if not better, a set of experiences operating in a completely open environment. And I think we now have enough small to medium-sized companies that are doing this reasonably successfully to have this be something that we can believe is really true. The other thing that sort of happened along the way is that once the sort of success of the collaborative development model for software became evident, almost everybody doing really interesting and innovative stuff ended up doing it in the open kind of model. We now see the vast majority of university research software development and things like that happening in an open and collaborative space. And so this leads to this interesting thing where if you want to have access to the innovation that's occurring, you have to somehow figure out how to be willing and able to participate in an open kind of collaborative model. And I think it goes even farther than that, because where does innovation really come from? If you listen to former CEOs at Microsoft, it comes from corporate development labs where they throw lots of money and hire smart people to sit there and think really good thoughts. But surprisingly often in my observation of history, it's come because somebody who was acting on their own interest or because they were passionate stumbled over or was willing to do unreasonable amounts of work to achieve some result that otherwise just wouldn't have happened. So, prove it, B-Dale. Do you recognize these guys? Oh, you're disappointing me. Does that help? That was Orville and Wilbur Wright. They're actually a really interesting example to study if you're into this sort of thing, because on the plus side, they were bicycle builders, and playing around with heavier than air airplanes was totally a hobby for them. This is not something anybody was paying them to do. They were not part of some aerospace industry corporate research lab, because before them there wasn't really an aerospace industry. On the flip side, if you care about sort of how evil people can be with patents, These are also a really interesting example to go read about, because man, did they try to really control and dominate their market for a long time. So what about this guy? Any of you recognize him? Yes, there's a theme. Yes, he's one of my personal heroes. Oh, come on, come on, come on. Robert Goddard. Yeah, so this guy, I think, is an even better example for us to think about in sort of the open, collaborative, community development kind of model, because here's a guy that started playing around with liquid fuel rocket stuff in his backyard. And believe it, that crazy thing, if you don't know, that's actually a rocket. The nozzle is actually up near the top, fuel tanks and all are down below, because obviously you want the flame tail going down over the fuel tanks. Might not have been the last model he built. But what I really like about this is he did some things, and he had some success. And because of his success, some people gave him some money so that he could go and do more experimentation and research. And the next thing you know, this is transitioning from being a hobby into being sort of a funded, day job kind of activity. And nowadays, NASA has a center named for him. That's not a bad progression. I wouldn't mind that. And my point is that, once again, here's somebody who was operating not because somebody told them, go invent the next new thing. They had a crazy idea, and they were willing to do an insane amount of work, and they were pretty open and collaborative about the results of that, and a whole industry was built based on it. So what's my point here, really? Well, a significant consequence of this community open collaborative development process that we sort of invented and have been operating around free software is that people we don't even know exist are enabled to invent things that we couldn't even imagine. And that's a source of open innovation that it would be really, really hard to have access to if you insisted on having everything be something that was, built yourself by your own employees and kept in some kind of proprietarily locked environment. And so my observation is that when users have the 4 freedoms, and if you unfortunately don't know what those are, go look them up, because you should read those at least once in your life. They can become developers, and that's when this innovation, this engine of open innovation really gets cranking. And it creates an immense amount of value that is what we now see existing out in the commons. And it also enables this thing that I think is immensely important, and I have seen be sort of a critical differentiator in a number of highly successful projects. And that's this thing I call the long tail of contribution. What do I mean? Well, when John and his friends at LWN and the Linux Foundation folks and so forth put out this report a number of years back and started putting out routinely called Who Writes the Linux Kernel, analyzing where all the commits came in each of the kernel releases, there were a bunch of plots that came along with that report. And it was always interesting to see, was the total number of developers who were submitting commits in each cycle increasing or decreasing? It's pretty much always increasing, if I can remember correctly. And you'd look, if you were working in the corporate world, you'd always flip real quickly to the page if which companies appeared to be, the most significant contributors, and you'd be disappointed if you weren't where you hoped that your company would be. And then I would flip to the chart that I was the most impressed by. And it didn't show up every time, but it showed up at least once, and it made a hell of an impression on me. And that was that they had taken all of the commits that had been made to the kernel, and they'd sort of done a Pareto, sorting them by the individuals who'd pushed the most commits into the tree. And it wasn't at all surprising on the left edge of that, where the tall bars were in the graph, that there were a bunch of names that we all recognized. They were sort of the heavies in the kernel development community. They mostly had full-time jobs by that point working on the Linux kernel. And you'd have been surprised and disappointed if they weren't all making big contributions to that code base. But the thing that really caught my attention is the bajillion people in each release who put in 1 commit. Who are those people? They're not people who are being paid to work on Linux full-time, or at least if they are, they probably need a different job. In my observation and from knowing some of the people who fell into that category, actually including myself once and twice, these were people who were sitting in a university lab on a Sunday afternoon and trying to get that one last piece of data to finish the research so they could start writing their thesis. and they stumbled over a bug, and they were, pissed off enough, just irritated enough, and it was getting in their way enough that they were actually willing to take a can opener to the source code, dig into it, find the one thing that was causing them grief. Oh, if that buffer were just a little bigger, it would actually, handle my transaction. Or, it really would be nice if I could actually use this particular floppy format and get the data off of my piece of test equipment, or whatever. There was some specific thing that mattered enough to them that they were willing to work on it and submitted a patch that the rest of the community ended up deciding was good enough to put into the main line and ship in the next release. And what's magical about that is that there is no company on earth that can hire that resource. That resource exists because the barrier to entry has been made low enough that it's possible for people to make an individual contribution. And so one of the things that I really believe is that if we want to build and sustain successful collaborative development communities, it's wickedly important that we have the right attributes around our projects and our code bases for it to be easy for people to access the code and make contributions. And it's also really important when we start talking about companies being involved that we do the right things to have these projects seem like reasonably level playing fields. Now, what I mean by that is if you ever find yourself in a situation of believing that you're doing a bunch of work and it's really mostly going to benefit other people and not you, that's a huge disincentive. And it's one of the things I'll talk about a little more in a minute. But that long tail of contribution, I think, is one of the things that really makes the open collaborative model of development as powerful as it is. And I will tell you that that was a very successful argument in a number of corporate meetings explaining to people why it was worth doing that one more little percentage point of work to make a particular product or software ecosystem more accessible and more open and more possible for people to make those sorts of contributions to over time. And so, over the years, I developed a sort of personal Pareto of, what were the things that I thought were attributes of successful software development communities. And, a lot of it has to do with sort of visible activity. Is there diverse participation? If there's like one company that's doing all the work, then okay, great. I'm glad it's open source and not secret source, but that doesn't necessarily make it great. And it leaves you a little concerned about what might happen in the future if that particular company loses interest. I remember, for example, having a conversation with an executive at one of the nonprofits in our ecosystem where I finally found myself just sort of staring at him and saying, okay, all right, hang on a second. How do you think we should decide when a particular piece of software is no longer relevant and should be deprecated? And his answer was really simple: when none of our member companies want to put money in it anymore. And I thought about that. I'm like, okay, if what we really care about is that sort of collaborative corporate engagement through a trade association kind of model, that's a completely reasonable answer. And if you're spending people's money, that's a pretty good way of deciding when something's not interesting anymore. But I thought about it from my perspective as a user and sort of hacker in software. And it's like, oh my God, no. Just because other people have lost interest doesn't mean I might have lost interest. How can I ensure that I don't ever lose the ability to keep tweaking on that and working on it and carrying it forward if it's important to me? And so some of this, really kind of matters. The other thing that I think I've already mentioned is really important is really low barriers to entry. I had a lovely conversation earlier today with some folks who were telling me about a system where there's a pretty good web interface for going in and making quick tweaks and seeing the results of them. I personally think this has a lot to do with sort of how a community is organized around software, sort of what are the policies, practices, and habits about how contributions get accepted, how they're vetted, who gets to decide what goes into what tree when, and all that sort of stuff. These things that we kind of wrap up sometimes and collectively call governance. Yeah, kind of an icky word, huh? So I think the thing that I sort of have come to distill out of this over time, and it's the place where I realize I've sort of ended up with something of a contrarian view, is that it does seem in a lot of circles these days in the corporate world that the conventional wisdom is that somehow, if we're not building open source communities based around permissive licenses that somehow are putting roadblocks in the way, and we're increasing the friction of interaction, and we're making it less likely that people will be able to have business success as a result of the work that they're doing. This is fake news. It's just not true. It's not the way the world works. The reality is that when I've observed what I think are really successful communities, those projects seem to be the ones that are built around successful habits of open contribution. And this seems, when you start with a permissive licensing structure, to require extra overhead to enable. What do I mean by that? I remember the first time after I was invited back to HP after taking early retirement, and I found myself in Paris at the OpenStack Summit that year, a community I'd never participated in before, and I was sort of there to soak it up because the company was making huge investments in it, and it was something I needed to understand and be able to help them with. And I found myself in the main hall during the time where they were handing out some awards to people who were community contributors. And I started thinking about it, and I started thinking about the fact that there was this whole extra layer that had been built in order to reward people for making contributions to the ecosystem. And I realized that this was because the default context was one in which contributions were not required or expected. And that caused me to think back on the fact that in a lot of the conversations I'd had in corporate meetings, there were these huge discussions about how do we decide what we should contribute and when we should contribute. And as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't always have to be driven by the choice of license, because one of the things we ended up doing in HP that allowed us to become, for a while, the largest contributors of code to the OpenStack community is that we just decided that we're going to sit down once and we're going to do the analysis of those elements of intellectual property that the company really holds dear to itself. We're going to look at what the business motivations are for participating in this large software ecosystem, and we're going to decide one time that it's okay for us to contribute anything that's relevant to meeting our own business objectives in that space. And having done that, we didn't find ourselves having to decide at the time of each individual contribution whether this was an okay thing to do. Because if you haven't been through this before, there is nothing more crippling to a company than realizing that, we now have to decide if there's one more little thing we want to contribute, and each time you have to fire up a legal department to go do a search of your patent holdings and do all of that research and make a decision about whether it's okay to release this particular piece of stuff. I had a lawyer at HP tell me at one point that the reason she thought the GPL was so cool was that when we agreed to participate and use code that was from a GPL project, we had to, up front, make the decision that this was the right thing for the company to do, and if it was, we were committing ourselves to making contributions of any further development work that we did on top of that base. And so in some sense to her, it was the easy license to pick, because we only had to go through this push-up and rigmarole process once, and then we could go ye forth and happily contribute to and participate in that community, and we didn't have to keep turning that crank over and over again. Obviously, whether that matters has a lot to do with the nature of who it is that's doing the work. If it's just me, BDL, sitting at home on nights and weekends, and I don't have some particular obligation to a particular employer that gets entangled in it, nobody cares. I can contribute what I want to whatever project I want, whenever I want. But it's certainly true that for every company I've ever been involved in, this has been a really big deal. And I bet most of you who are here work for people who kind of care about these issues. And unfortunately, because it's sort of popular right now for the lawyers that provide support to startups in the Bay Area and all the people who end up taking example from them to believe that the only way things can work is if people have permission to take anything they want and do whatever they want with it, I think that we're often finding ourselves making bad bets. Because in sort of the history of that traditional development model of innovation, corporate innovation, where you'd make an investment, you'd invent something new, you'd get a patent on it, and you'd milk it for a while, there was always that point where that particular piece of technology matured. And if you've ever studied this sort of economic stuff, there's a term called a cash cow, which is, we're not going to invest in this anymore, it's done. We're just going to keep gathering the revenue as long as we can, and it still seems relevant. I've wondered, and I have seen vestiges of this behavior here and there, but not pervasively enough to know for sure, if there isn't a similar kind of thing that could happen in permissively licensed large open source communities when the luster is off, the corporate financial contributions go away, and all of a sudden everybody who's put some money into it and thinks they want to continue generating some kind of return thinks that the way to have it be a cash cow is to go differentiate with it, create their own separate version, take it out of the commons, treat this all of a sudden as something they'll continue working on only proprietarily. And that's not a really good formula for long-term health of an open and collaborative ecosystem. So I think the thing that I've come to believe even more firmly after spending the better part of 3 decades working in the corporate world, and now on the order of 4 decades participating in the free and open source software world, is that there's something really fundamentally important about share-alike licensing terms. And it's the reason that every project that I've started myself in, as long as I can remember, has been released under the GPL. And it's the reason that I have worked pretty hard to help companies understand, the ones that have been interested in talking to me, that this is a model that can make sense and can be successful and can lead to good results both for them and for all of the other players in the ecosystems that they're dabbling in. And this is why, to me, if we're going to bet on open source, if we're going to accept that this has become the dominant development and maintenance model for software and a lot of other similar digital kinds of assets in the world, we shouldn't be placing tiny little bets and sort of sticking our toe in the pool to see if it's cool or warm. We should just go all in. Jump in, the water's fine, it'll be okay, and we'll have a good time, hopefully forever. With that, I'm going to wrap up, except I want to throw a shout out to my friends at the New Zealand Rocketry Association. Their National Launch Day is coming up on the 3rd of February up near Taupiri on the North Island. I had hoped to be there, but unfortunately a little family thing that's going on back home means that I'm cutting my trip short and I'll be on an airplane tomorrow. So I will be around the rest of today and at the Penguin Dinner tonight if you have things you'd like to ask about. I don't think we really have, we've only got a minute or 2 left. I guess if somebody has one burning question, we could try to take it. But with that, I'll thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Bedell. That was great. If anyone's got a really pressing question, otherwise we will. No. Okay.
I'll be around. Happy to talk. Thanks.